Tell me about a great moment you had while playing sports. The first thing that comes to mind is being on our junior high school football team in 1950 at the old West Hill High and winning the city championship, going undefeated during the entire season. I played fullback, and I was also the kicker. Where did you spend your summer vacation as a child? We spent our summers in a very small house, paid mainly from money my mother won in a contest for Italian bomb, in Plage Laval, about 20 miles from Montreal. The name was changed after World War II to Laval Ouest because of the terrible reputation it had during the war, with regular brawls at Cozy Corner between servicemen and quote-unquote zoot suitors, aka draft dodgers. We had no cars, so to get there we walked to Snowden Junction in Montreal to board the number 17 streetcar to Val-Royal train station, then took the train to Laval-sur-le-Lac. We then had about a half-mile walk to our house, often carrying a cat. Our family of 5 squeezed into the house that had no toilet or shower, no bathroom, no fridge, and no phone. We had an outhouse, bathed in nearby Lake of Two Mountains, used ice blocks in our fridge, and used a friend's phone if necessary. Occasionally we were 6, with sisters Pat or Norma inviting a friend to stay for a few days. I would sleep on the veranda, which I thought was cool. There were 2 dance halls in town, Cozy Corner and the Roxy, which was close to us. Up until I was 12, I spent most of my days at the, probably polluted, Lake of Two Mountains. When I was about 5, my mother knitted a bathing suit for me, which, when wet, came down to my knees, so I didn't want to come out of the water. Starting around age 12, I caddied at nearby Laval-sur-le-Lac golf course. Initially, I was paid about 75 cents per bag per round. Several weekends as a teen, I watched a group of men illegally gambling, playing poker or craps, and they bought me lunch for running across the highway to get them hot dogs and cokes. Bopa and I later became friends with one of these men and his wife, and we often curled with them in Rosemere. I always loved those summers and felt sorry for the guys on our street who spent the summer in Montreal. Actually, there were 3 dance halls in town. The third one was the Bluebird, which was across the highway from our house. It served as both our grocery store/butcher and a dance hall featuring barn dances, and the caller for these dances was the butcher Jean Tourangeau. What was one of your favorite children's stories, and what was the one that you found the scariest? As a youngster, I liked most of the stories in a book called Grimm's Fairy Tales. I also liked the book Dumbo about a baby elephant that learned how to fly. I never really got interested in the Tom Sawyer series of books, which were very popular back then. The one I found the most scariest was, believe it or not, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. I found the picture of the witch in the book we had very scary, and all my sister Norma had to do was open the page there to scare the wits out of me. Finally, my mother tore that page out of the book for obvious reasons. I've never been much of a reader, and I suppose that started in my childhood. As I got a little older, I loved reading all kinds of sports pocketbooks, some of which are in our cold storage, I think. What were your favorite toys as a child? What games did you play with the other kids in the neighborhood? And why are you wearing a suit in that photo of you playing baseball? Depending on my age as a child, I had several favorite toys. I had a top that made a whirring sound as it spun around. Then there was the car that had the head of Mortimer Snurd, a puppet operated by ventriloquist Edgar Bergen, that turned around after bumping into something like a wall. Like every boy, I had a model train set that was probably an antique that my dad gave me. The train those days was made by Lionel. We would set up the tracks on the floor of the dining room around the table. Unfortunately, it had to be removed after every use. I also liked the 3 popular toys of the day, including a yo-yo, bolo bat, and a diddle. A rep from these toys would come on the street from time to time, and depending on the tricks you could do, he'd give you a bronze, silver, or gold badge. We played all kinds of sports on our street, which was a dead end, and in those days few cars or trucks, but deliveries by horse-drawn wagons. Of course, the horses often left a souvenir in the middle of our game. We had all kinds of boys around my age, so getting a game of hockey, baseball, or touch football was never a problem. Another favorite game was Between the Bases, which wore out the grass in front of our houses. One day, a photographer appeared on Duluth Avenue, taking pictures of anyone around. If you wanted a picture, your parent had to give him a deposit. When I went home to tell my mother, she insisted that I change from my Play Street clothes to a suit, my first suit when I was 12 or 13. So I was the only guy on the street wearing a suit as he pretended to play baseball. My mother was a stickler for appearances. What were your parents like? Did you know any of their brothers and sisters? What about your grandparents? Luckily, I had two wonderful parents who managed to survive the Depression despite a very limited income and keep my sisters Patty and Norma and I well fed and always living in comfortable accommodations. They somehow even managed to have a home in the country talked about previously. Thankfully, they moved from Winnipeg, where they were married in 1923, to Montreal. My dad was born in Dublin and came to Canada when he was about 24. He worked most of his life at Dale & Company, an insurance company on St. Nicholas Street in downtown Montreal. He used an expression, "the ghost walked," every payday, and where that came from, I don't know. He was a mason at the Lodge of Antiquity on Sherbrooke Street in Montreal. He also had a wonderful knack for growing roses at our country home and made his own bug spray out of pipe tobacco and water. I met his brother Fred, who lived in Bondi Beach, Australia, and who also bought me my first set of golf clubs. I met Dad's sister, Emily, who lived in Ireland, when she paid a short visit to Oakville in 2001. Dad was orphaned at a very young age, so I never knew his parents, my grandparents. My mother was born in Montreal and had 8 living siblings, plus one who died at age 3, named Reggie, Harley, Bertha, Florence, Lorna, Vivian, Eva, and Agnes. I knew them all, and a few times got hockey tickets from Uncle Reggie for the Montreal Forum to watch Le Canadien. Florence and Lorna worked for an ad agency. Vivi worked for an importer named Mr. Burden, and then she married Mr. Burden very late in life. For a short while, she had a convenience store in Notre-Dame-de-Grâce. Eva worked all her life for a lawyer. Agnes married Roland, who, after serving in World War II, sadly turned out to be an alcoholic. The 2 boys, Vivi, Agnes, and of course my mother, had spouses, but the other 4 aunties never married. My grandfather died when I was less than a year old, and my grandmother died when I was 14. He was part owner of a roofing company called Norman and Colley. My grandmother always struck me as having a very matriarchal appearance. My mother did wonders raising us on a very limited income. She was a strong swimmer and taught us how at the baby beach in Plage. She was a very good gardener, and every winter she planted seeds in used cheese boxes in the living room windows for later planting in the spring. I helped by collecting residue from the delivery horses that came on our street. People those days planted what they termed victory gardens. She was also a great cook and made great chocolate cake and her infamous hermit cookies. She generally shopped once a week with a neighbor, Mrs. Levine, and after shopping they came into our house for a glass or 2 of sherry, for medicinal reasons. She worked for some years at McGill University in the Students' Union and was more like a mother to many students. Tragically, my mother was killed by a commuter train in Rosemere 2 months after we were married, after attending a birthday party for my nephew Gary. Getting back to the 4 aunties who took the place of grandparents, each seemed to have their role whenever we visited. Florence was known for pouring drinks that made your hair stand up. Lorna served in World War II, I believe as a Wren, and entertained by inviting us to watch hockey games upstairs on her TV. Vivi always had some craft or coloring to do on the dining room table, now in our house, and poor Eva seemed to get stuck with all the cooking. Somehow the 4 of them survived in the same house with really only 1 bathroom. Mind you, our duplex on Duluth only had 1 bathroom too, and no shower or running hot water. My dad had to light a jacket heater in the basement to get hot water. Saturday night was bath night, and I had to wait until Patty and Norma finished before I was allowed in, being the dirtiest. Those were supposedly the good old days. What was your first boss like? My first boss was at Molson's Brewery in Montreal in the payroll department. He was the payroll supervisor, and his name was Len Sear. I had just finished high school and knew nothing about working in an office. He gently told me that proper dress included a tie and jacket, and if it was really hot, the office wasn't air-conditioned, I could remove the jacket. In those days, the plant employees were paid in cash every week. The payroll ledgers were prepared by 3 operators, and if mistakes were made, we had to add column after column of numbers to ensure the changes were correct. He taught me how to add by tens to save a lot of time. We had a special counter machine that we used so the bank could send us the exact number of bills and coins required for the weekly payroll. The cash was put into small envelopes that had the employee name, number, and amount on the front. Len was a very patient man and put up with a lot of fooling around. I learned where parts of the brewery were by helping distribute the pay to the workers. Too often, I spilled several envelopes on the floor, which delayed the process but amused the employees. Being a low man on the totem pole, I got stuck with some of the Joe jobs. I had to go downstairs in the morning to get a pot of coffee for our group, and in the afternoon would go down for a pot of terrible-tasting tea. That's probably why to this day I don't drink tea. The afternoon would also have cookies and sometimes cake. Anytime they had a jelly roll cake, I'd bring some home for my mother. While I was there, one of my coworkers got tuberculosis and had to go to a sanitarium in the Laurentians for several weeks. We all had to go for chest x-rays as a precaution. Although it was very hot, Len kept our windows closed because the smell of our neighbor Dominion Rubber salvaging rubber was overwhelming. I couldn't have asked for a better boss to start my first job, as some others that followed were not as understanding. It was under him that I got my first raise in October. I went from the pricely sum of $120 per month to $130. And that for a 40-hour week with no overtime pay. The good old days? What were your mom and dad like when you were a child? What about your sisters? My dad was 47 and my mom was 36 when I was born. They somehow lived through the Great Depression of 1929 with one child, my sister Patty, born in 1927. Norma was born about a year and a half before me, so we were much closer in age. I remember growing up in the upper duplex on Duluth in what was called Snowdon. Patty started West Hill High when I started kindergarten, and Norma was 2 years ahead, both of us in Iona Avenue School. I got along well with both sisters, although I'm told I was spoiled by my parents being the baby in the family. Being much closer in age, I did more things with Norma than Patty. I remember Patty had a very good voice and played the piano. Although my bedroom was very small, I didn't have to share it the way Patty and Norma did. Patty had a boyfriend who gave me a baseball autographed by the 1946 Montreal Royals team, which that year had Jackie Robinson on the team. Had I kept it, instead of playing baseball on the street with it, I could have sold it for thousands of dollars today. Norma taught me the basics of how to dance, including the jitterbug. At a young age, we did more things together in Plage Laval at our country home than in Montreal. Norma had several boyfriends, including one who performed professionally in the ice capades. Probably because of the gender and or age difference, I didn't play sports with either sister. I had great parents. When I was young, my dad worked 6 days a week for Dale & Company in downtown Montreal. He was a real churchgoer and would take me to Sunday school while he attended church. We also went to several parades, and he loved the marching bands. He also liked to walk, so I would often go with him. In the summer, we would play badminton and golf around our house in Plage, where I dug 4 holes and put in tin cans. He was a great rose grower and had a huge bed of them in the backyard. I remember he wore a bathing suit that covered his chest and back when he went swimming. He never had a car, so we all had to rely on public transportation to get around. He liked gravy on every kind of meat, so my mother made it with things like sausages. He also liked liver for supper, which I hated, so my mother would grind it up with bread and put it in a sandwich for me. I don't remember him ever disciplining me, which I think he left up to my mother. He was a pipe smoker, but a non-drinker, and liked doing crossword puzzles. Mom somehow kept us all fed and clothed on a very limited budget. She was a wonderful cook and sewer, and made a lot of clothes, particularly for Patty and Norma. She played the piano and had a good singing voice. Of course, there was no dishwasher in those days, so dishes were done in the sink. I remember her badly cutting her fingers on the cutlery, as my dad had sharpened all the knives without warning her. I vividly remember her signing my report card a Gladys D. McKenzie, with D standing for disgusted because of the terrible marks the teacher gave me. I hated the teacher because she tried to hammer home that I should write with my right hand, not my left. My writing was terrible, so I printed just about everything all through school and university. I don't remember her doing much entertaining, except for the aunties from time to time. I had to eat the crusts she cut off from the sandwiches so I wouldn't be hungry for a lot of sandwiches. We always went to her when we were sick, and she had a host of homeopathic cures. They included having your back and chest rubbed with goose grease after the weekly bath in the winter to close the pores to prevent colds. I had still had terrible colds every winter. Another one was swallowing Vaseline covered with sugar to loosen the phlegm if you had a cold. This would be followed by inhaling steam from boiling friar's balsam on a burner. I also remember the advice she gave my sisters, to always carry a large hat pin in case a man approached, and you know where to use it. She was a strong swimmer and taught us how to swim, starting with an automobile inner tube borrowed from a neighbor. Needless to say, I was horrified when she was killed by a train in Rosemere about 2 months after Baba and I were married. What was one of the best dates you've been on? One of the best dates that I can remember was in 1954, I think, and lasted a week with Baba. It was a canoe trip through several small lakes north of Montreal. It was under the auspices of the YMCA and led by a Mr. McGarrigle, who was also our chaperone. We had a portage from lake to lake, carrying our canoes, large, heavy canvas tents, and required food and clothing. There were about 20 of us, a mix of males and females, all about our age except for one guy who was probably in his 40s. We were awakened first thing every morning around 7 a.m. with a loud voice announcing, "First call for prunes!" We bathed in the freezing water of the lake, which really woke you up. We cooked all our own meals, which were not very fancy, but there was plenty of it. One of the staples at breakfast and dinner was fried spam, which is a kind of pressed meat concoction in cans. There was no alcohol on our journey. With no refrigeration, a lot of food and drink you take for granted at home are non-existent on the trip. I particularly hated the bathroom facility at all our stops, which was a log stretched over a hole we dug, then filled with earth when we left. I was always used to sitting on the toilet for probably 15 minutes, reading a sports book or magazine. Try sitting on a log that long doing your thing, and you certainly have no interest in reading. I vividly remember roughly halfway through the trip, stopping early one morning in a town called the Lake Chapleau, where we were able to get a full breakfast with decent coffee. They also had flush toilets where I think I sat for a long time. That was a welcome break. We both had really great suntans, and our knees were almost burned from sitting so long in a canoe. Baba used to get a very dark brown in those days. Luckily, the gang we were with were a lot of fun, and the days just flew by. The weather also cooperated, and we had mostly sunny days with little rain during the day. We did have rain a few of the nights, and you have to be careful not to touch the tent when it's wet, or water will come in at that point. The final night was back at the lodge, where we had a great dinner and slept in a proper bed. Men and women in separate accommodations, of course. Unfortunately, one of the group that made this journey after us were careless and managed to burn down most of one of the islands we visited. The YMCA were forced to cancel all further trips. Always some slobs in any group. How did you get your first job? When I finished my final year of high school, my marks were not good enough to matriculate. I intended to write 2 supplemental exams to get enough marks to get into university or grade 12 high school, which was accepted as the first year of university and also much cheaper. In the meantime, I applied for summer jobs at several different companies, including Canadair, they made and tested airplanes, CIL, where I said I'd take a job in the plant with a view to being a salesman, and IBM, where I wanted to train to be able to sell those brain machines, aka computers. Out of desperation, I went to the unemployment department of the government. They suggested 2 jobs, namely Rolls-Royce of Canada and Molson's Brewery. I thought the latter would be really neat to tell all my friends. He said he would set up an interview, but strongly suggested I don't wear my football jacket to the interview, as I had to all my previous interviews. I went down to the brewery for an interview with a Mr. Beebe. I later learned it was actually Deeb. I lied when he asked me if it was for the summer only, and I said no. They hired me on July 7th, 1952, and as you know, I started as a payroll clerk. I had a call from CIL in August saying they had an opening and wanted to do another interview. By that time, I had received my supplemental exam results, which were good enough to get me into grade 12. So I thought, why go there for less than a month when I was going back to school at the beginning of September? I was late registering for grade 12 in what was now the new West Hill High that had both a new principal and assistant principal. I was interviewed by both, and after some time, they felt I was only coming back to play football, true to some extent, and they would probably flunk me out of school by Christmas. And because of this crappy prospect, I stayed at my job at Molson's Brewery for the next 37.5 years, working in Montreal, St. John's, and Toronto. How did you propose to Bopa? When did you know that you wanted to marry her? I first met Bopa in March 1953 at the YMCA in Montreal. I was going to Sir George Williams College at night back then, where she was at the door selling tickets for a barn dance being held there. She said I could come in without paying. I was 18 at the time and Bopa was 19. We started dating shortly after that on a regular basis, even when they moved to Beaconsfield every year. I traveled by bus to her country house. She also traveled by streetcar and train to our country house in Plage-Laval. After a few years of going steady, we both knew we wanted to get married, but because we were quite young, agreed we should wait a few years to get married, and I was earning a decent salary at Molson. In those days, it was customary to seek the approval of her parents for getting married. Boba's father sort of grunted okay, but her mother said yes if I would go to the annual St. Patrick's Ball. Since I had no intention of attending this formal occasion, it created a bit of friction with her mother. In those days, a mixed marriage meant Protestant and Catholic, which could create problems. We thought it best to settle this now. We agreed to be married in the Catholic Church to help keep things positive, but would raise our children as Protestant. As to the actual proposal, it went like this. In those days, we both smoked, so I emptied a pack of cigarettes, fastened the engagement ring to a cigarette with Scotch tape, and put it back in the package. I gave Bopa the package and asked her to light a cigarette for me. Obviously, when she opened the package, there was my ingenious method of giving her the ring and formally asking her to marry me. That was about 68 years ago. Time sure flies when you're having fun. What makes you happy? It doesn't take a lot of writing to say what makes me happy at my age. Good health for myself, Bopa, and the rest of our family is my easy answer to the question. Luckily, we have all recovered from various ailments, which at the time were quite serious. Feeling that we can rely on family for support is also nice to know, as there is no apparent friction within our extended family. This is probably an obvious and brief answer to the question, but I really don't need to say any more. How did you get interested in gardening? My interest in gardening probably came from my parents, both of whom were excellent gardeners. Some of which I've already said in previous stories are repeated here. The gardening they did was at our country home in Plage-Laval, a suburb of Montreal. My father's specialty was roses, and he had a huge bed of them in full bloom behind our house. He was a great believer and user of sheep doo-doo as fertilizer and made his own bug spray, a mixture of water and tobacco. It seemed to work really well. Any visitor got a bouquet of them to take home. My mother was the flower and vegetable expert and started many plants from seed, sitting in empty Kraft cheese boxes in the window of our living room on Duluth Avenue, Montreal. I helped provide fertilizer for her by picking up horse manure on our street in an empty fruit basket. Hell, I was paid a whole 10 cents per basket, which bought a lot of penny candy in those days. We then had to bring these seedlings on a streetcar, then a train, to get them to our country home. I had some nice rose plants in front of our home in Rosemere and grew several different vegetables in our backyard there. Tomatoes, wax beans, radishes, onions, cucumber, etc. grew well in our clay soil. It didn't fare too well in St. John's, Newfoundland, because our backyard was loaded with rock and very little soil. Then in our present home in Oakville, I tried growing pears and tomatoes, but the fruit was eaten by skunks, squirrels, and raccoons before they were ripe, so I never had a chance to pick the fruit. I also found gardening a very relaxing time and wish I could have done more of it in our present house. What are your favorite TV shows? What about before TV? Did you go to the movies or listen to radio shows? When did your family get its first TV? I remember when I was about 15 years old, a kid on the next street built his own TV and asked a few of us to watch it with him. We sat there in awe as faint shadows appeared on the screen with scratchy sound followed by a whole lot of snow with nothing else. This was my first introduction to what would eventually develop. We got our first TV when I was about 18 years old. It was a black and white one. I believe it was a 16-inch size with rabbit ears that had to be adjusted just right to get any reception. We watched mainly the CBC and had no access to any American channels. The Ed Sullivan variety show on Sunday night was a biggie, as was Gillette's Friday Night Boxing. Our Pet, Juliet, was a popular Canadian variety show hosted by a rather buxom blonde. I was too old to watch the variety of children's shows in those days, but there were several. Soap operas were also followed by many, but they didn't really interest me. I vividly remember watching the Alfred Hitchcock mystery show with my parents, and to add to the drama, they had to watch it with the lights turned off. Shortly after Bopa and I were married, I attached an antenna to the chimney on the roof of our apartment, which gave us a few American TV channels with so-so reception. The location was also beside the vent from the apartment toilets, so the smell was quite overwhelming during installation. As to favorite TV shows, I like sports, like golf, tennis, and curling. Rarely ever watch baseball, football, hockey, or basketball. Shows in the past included, of course, MASH and Perry Mason. Currently, I like NCIS and FBI series. Before we had a TV, I rarely went to the movies by myself, and only started to on a somewhat regular basis with Baba. We of course had a radio, and often listened to news programming, and my dad's radio got shortwave programming mainly from the UK. A favorite mystery show then was The Green Hornet. Friend of those that had no friends, and enemy to those that made him an enemy. A lunchtime favorite was a Canadian show called The Happy Gang.
Keep happy with the happy gang. Keep happy, start your day with a bang.
My dad also made a crystal set for me, using an empty toilet paper roll, with headphones that, with great precision, I could listen to the Toronto Maple Leaf hockey games featuring play-by-play announcer Foster Hewitt. I generally fell asleep before the game was over. Susan will remember we got our first color TV in Rosemere to watch the Summer Olympics held in Montreal in 1976. By that time, cable television had arrived, so of course many more channels were now available to watch. Hard to believe that was almost 50 years ago. What are your favorite movies? What was it like going to the movies when you were a kid? I'll start by talking about going to movies as a kid. Because of a terrible fire in one of the theaters in Montreal, a bylaw was passed prohibiting children under 16 from going to a theater without an adult. The only movies I remember going to were held on Friday evening at Dominion Douglas Church at the top of the Côte-Saint-Luc Road on Roslyn Avenue in Westmount. We paid the princely sum of 10 cents to get in. I recall a lot of Audie Murphy, Abbott and Costello, Laurel and Hardy, and cowboy and Indian movies were shown. You did not have to be 16 to go. I was never much of a fan of going to the movies, and when I did, they were always double-headers preceded by an old Warner Path newsreel and a cartoon. There were no commercials. I went to a lot more movies after I started dating Baba, going to the Snowdon Theatre, Monkland Theatre, Kent Theatre, Westmount Theatre, York Theatre, Her Majesty's Theatre, and Seville Theatre. The latter two had live acts, such as Blackstone the Magician and crooner Johnny Ray. I don't think any of these theaters are still in operation. I also went to an outdoor movie theater during the summer months in Plage Laval. We sat on benches, which were very hard on the rear end. You prayed it wouldn't rain because we were not undercover. As to favorite movies, I always liked comedy with Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, and Jerry Lewis. 12 Angry Men, High Noon, The Sound of Music, and The Music Man were also some of my favorites. The only movie I've been to in the last 5 years was a special showing of A Military Tattoo. I cannot believe how much food the people bring into the theater and the long-lasting commercials, which went for close to half an hour before the main movie. The last time Baba and I went to a movie was about 20 years ago. It was a matinee showing in Florida with a 99-cent special admission rate for seniors. They then overcharged for the popcorn to get you that way. I much prefer watching movies on TV in the comfort of my lazy boy and can fall asleep if the spirit moves me, or go to the bathroom, or snack as I please. It must be quite obvious that I have never been much of a fan of going to the movies. Addendum. I could also add one other story about attending a movie. As a family, we went to a drive-in near Lake Memphremagog. Narrator's note, no clue if that was pronounced properly. I found a spot and parked the car, then attached the speaker to the window on my door. Someone didn't like the spot and wanted to move elsewhere. I backed out and, in my haste, forgot the speaker was attached to the car, so I ripped the attached cord off the stand and dumped it on the ground at our new parking spot, then attached a new speaker. Never did own up to my carelessness.